Jimmy Carter. Okay, so I know I'm behind. I'm gonna get this out to you, but this is your PowerPoint for Jimmy Carter. He was a one-term president. That's all. He came in right after Ford, and Ford wasn't even a term president. He was there after Nixon. So let's look at a few things. Okay, so Gerald Ford. Of course, we've talked about how he became president after Nixon resigned. One of his first acts was to pardon Nixon for his crimes. Pardon came under heavy criticism. It happens, right? So the economy. Under Ford, we start to see a problem. We start to see Ford's major worries were economic ones. Americans suffered from what was known as stagflation, and it is a high unemployment combined with rising inflation. So your unemployment's high, and when unemployment's high, that means a lot of people are out of jobs, and the unemployment rate is actually calculated by the number of people that are actively looking for a job. So the unemployment rate at this time was very high because there was an active number of people looking for a job, and it's combined with inflation, and inflation is very important for you to understand. This means that the price of goods are continuing to rise, but people are not making more money to make or to reach that level. So people are still making the same amount of money, or they don't have a job, but the price on goods, such as bread and sugar and stuff like that, continue to get higher. And so people aren't making money to account for that inflation to, make money to buy products. And so stagflation, so that really means the economy is stagnant. It's not doing anything because people don't have the money or don't have the job to pay the prices for goods that they need, or they don't have the extra income to buy like automobiles and stuff like that. Okay. Now, I got ahead of myself. Hold on. What happened? Okay, sorry, I hit a button. Okay, so you kind of understand that, and that was under Ford. Of course, we have OPEC, which Ford doesn't see an issue with OPEC until, well, it's a little bit of Ford and it's a little bit of Jimmy Carter, strictly because Ford has to deal with it, and Carter inherits it, and he actually starts an issue with the OPEC brand. So OPEC is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. It's literally a anagram for the beginning of the word. It had been formed by oil-producing countries in the 1960s, and here on the screen to your right, you can see the oil exporting countries, and as you can tell, they're mostly African and Middle Eastern countries. So you're going to see that that's going to be a big deal. Like it says, most are Arab countries. In '73, the Arab nations used oil as a political weapon, and we're still seeing OPEC use oil as a political weapon. Thankfully, today in the U.S., we have produced enough oil locally that we can, if they decide to do something crazy and use it as a political weapon, we can actually depend on our own oil. Now, the oil embargo of '73. So OPEC member nations imposed an oil embargo on the United States. It's a big deal. So overnight, the price of oil shoots up. Basically, we get this oil embargo because we have backed Israel in some random war that they were having with the Middle Eastern country, and since we did that, OPEC decided to say, hey, you're going to support Israel, we're going to make your price of oil shoot up. And so the price of a barrel of oil shot up, which if oil goes up, all the products that are made from oil, i.e. gas, or diesel, which is just the whatever, we're not going to go into it, but things that are made from oil, their prices are going to go up because now their businesses have to pay that extra money for the oil to make the product. And so we're going to see the price of oil shoot up, so we're going to see people running out to get gas, kind of like the toilet paper thing you just saw, which really has nothing to do with, the coronavirus, but it was because, people needed toilet paper and they want to make sure they have it, that kind of thing, has a severe impact on the American economy. Guys, this is very big. We start to see gas shortages because we're not getting the oil. We're having an oil shortage, so we're having a gas shortage, and people aren't able to get as much gas as they are. You're going to start seeing things like gas lines. And guys, these were wrapped around the block a couple of times, and people would actually run out of gas waiting in the gas lines, and people would have to help push their cars up into the pump, and it was a pretty big deal. No, I was not alive in 73, so don't even ask. Okay, so these are old STAAR test questions, and since we don't have a STAAR test this year, I'm going to just pull them off. We're just going to skip them. So here you can see gas lines, old 1960s and 70s vehicles, old Oldsmobiles and stuff. You can see the gas lines, and it was a big deal. Okay, so petroleum, petro, it's another word for oil. The higher energy costs impacted the economy, which also impacts the price of food, electricity, gasoline, heating a home. You need oil. You need oil to run the machines that make food. You need oil to run the machines you need oil for everything. We have pretty much used oil for anything that we need. So we start to see electricity shoots up. Gasoline, of course, is a byproduct of oil. Heating a home, you need the propane, and that's also, you know, gasoline. You need that kind of stuff to heat a home. And electricity, so it's all together, okay? Oh, wrong way. Sorry. Okay, so the Helsinki Accords in 75, U.S., Canada, and the Soviet Union are going to sign an international agreement. So basically, they're going to recognize post-World War II borders and promised respect for human rights. And a lot of this comes from the, post-World War I, where we didn't, or not us, but some European countries like, I don't know, Germany, didn't respect the current borders. And of course, so when you have the big ones like U.S. and Canada, which I don't understand, whatever, in the Soviet Union, basically it was to get the Soviet Union not to extend its borders. And because you realize, remember during when we started the Cold War, they had their satellite countries underneath them, which was a buffer, they were buffer states. And then, of course, respect for human rights. And the human rights were a big deal, especially because of the Holocaust and the Armenian massacres and, and then Stalin doing his stuff. And it was pretty big. So Jimmy Carter becomes president in 77. Actually, he's elected in 76 and then 76 to 80, but he doesn't actually take office until January of 71 or 77. So many Americans, of course, are going to continue to blame for Republicans for the Watergate scandal because it was a Republican president, Republican vice president, and of course, Republicans are going to get the blame for the Watergate scandal. So let's put a Democrat in office. So he's, of course, nominated by the Democratic Party, and he's a very morale type guy, You're going to have good morals. He's going to boost morale. This is supposed to think. And his promise, his campaign slogan was to clean up, quote unquote, Washington. And so, and that was a big deal because of the issue with the Watergate scandal. Okay, so his domestic policy, things that were happening within the United States. Chief problem, of course, is the economy, which he inherits from Nixon and Ford. The U.S. depends on oil. I mean, guys, the dependence on oil is crazy, and oil prices continue to rise, and so it's crazy expensive. Inflation was more than 10%, and you really don't want inflation to be more than 10% because it becomes a big deal. Unemployment remains high, and so when people are out of jobs, people are getting paid not as much, and the price of goods are going up. You're still in that stagflation. Your economy's stagnant. It's not doing anything. It's not going up. It's not going down. It's just quid pro quo. Now, he does the Community Reinvestment Act, and this is many banks excluded people in low-income neighborhoods, of course, from this loan, and he pushes the Community Reinvestment Act. It passed to stop discriminatory credit practices against the poor people, or against poor people, but there was also a bunch of kickback on that. Whatever happened to, if you can't afford it, you can't buy it. But this was to try and get those to reinvest in the community, and it was a thing to try and get the economy up and moving. And it required the banks to make credit available into the poorer communities. Now, they might make the loans available to them, but they're going to have a very high interest rate, and you still see that today. Okay, so the Panama Canal Treaty in 77, bonus points that don't count for anything. If you can tell me after what war you get the Panama Canal, and of course I just said it's Spanish-American War. So we get the Panama Canal. I've shown you all that. We've looked at it. So Jimmy Carter signs a treaty that returns control of the canal zone. So that area in Panama that is the canal zone, and it returns it to Panama. Now, we return everything to Panama except for the canal itself, because we can make some money off the canal, and of course we have a stagnant economy, so we need to be able to make some money and bring some money into the economy, so we keep the canal itself and make some money, but everything surrounding it, the zone, goes back to Panama. After that, the United States is going to further agree to turn over the canal itself to Panama by the end of the century. And that's the end of the 20th century, so around 99, 2000. I think it really happened back into like the early 2000s is when they officially got control of it. That's something I'd have to double check. Okay, so Spanish-American War. Which president? Teddy Roosevelt, remember? Okay, so we're going to skip this. Okay, so Palestinian and Israel Authority. We're going to start to see an issue with Palestine and Israel. We still have that today. The Gaza Strip, that kind of thing. It's Palestine and Israel backed up to each other, and so there's this area in between Israel and Palestine that is it's known as the Gaza Strip, and it's still fighting today. So Israel was a homeland for the Jewish people, and it was created that way by the UN in 1948, and they create Israel. Well, Israel's not created, it's already a country, but it's established as a homeland for the Jewish people in 1948 by the UN because of the fact of what happened to them during the Holocaust and during World War II. So and then of course Palestine's going to get very upset about that. So you can see in this graphic, in the first picture, 1947, you see Palestine is basically it's Palestinian controlled, and then by 47 it starts becoming a little bit more Israeli controlled, and then 49 to 67, and then of course present day. I couldn't tell you what present day is when this was made, but it would probably be and we're into the 2000s, 2015-ish. So very modern. There's not a lot of Palestinians that still live in Israel because of course the Jewish faith is very prevalent in that area. It's not very heavily Muslim unless you go across and you become into Palestine. Of course, many Jews had already been living in that area. There were also Palestinian Arabs. Truman supported the creation of Israel because remember he is still president in 48 when the UN actually creates it as a homeland for the Jewish people. Quickly, Egypt and Israel. Egypt and Israel had fought in a series of wars since 1948. In 77, President Carter invited the President of Egypt and the Prime Minister of Israel to a retreat. They meet at Camp David in Maryland, which is the presidential retreat near the White House for presidents to get out of the White House and go do other things in Camp David. I know y'all have heard of Camp David. So this is known as the Camp David Accords. Israel actually agrees to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. And of course, y'all know of Mount Sinai and everything that happens in that area. And if you look at Egypt, it's got this little, over to the side, it's got this little thing that juts down, and that's the Sinai Peninsula. And so Israel agrees to return that in turn for peace treaties and stuff like that. Egypt is going to offer a peace treaty and normal diplomatic relations with Israel. This is going to end about 30 years of warfare, and this is a big deal, a very big deal, because it actually will, some Arab nations, Middle Eastern nations, are going to be very upset by this. And so after the 30 years, it's ended 30 years of warfare. And like I said, these are old STAR Test questions, and since we're not doing STAR Test. So the president of Egypt, I'm not even going to attempt to say his name, and the prime minister of Israel, I'm not even going to say his name. I'm not even going to attempt it. They are actually going to sign the Camp David Accords. Of course, Jimmy Carter is seen because he's the one that brought the two nations together. Like I said earlier, many Arab leaders from the Middle Eastern areas were upset over providing no homeland, though, for the Palestinians. So this is a homeland for the Jewish, or for the, the Jewish faith, or for the Jewish people, but there's not a homeland for the Palestinians. And so it becomes, but they're really upset because now one Arab nation has actually begun peace talks with a non-Arab nation, and it becomes a really big deal for the Arab nations, and they realize that they're losing support for their strong Arab pride, I guess. Okay, so Soviet relations, remember, we're still in the middle of the Cold War. We're still going strong. We're not. The Soviet Union's still holding out. They're not doing so hot, but they're holding out. So the Carter continues Nixon's policy of détente with the Soviet Union. No big deal, which means no fighting, anything like that. We're not going to, no hot fire. In 79, which is the pretty much last year of his presidency, the Soviet Union actually invades Afghanistan. And this is a very important deal because this is going to start a series of issues with the Soviet Union that Reagan will then have to deal with Gorbachev. So you're going to see this problem become a big deal. This brought, of course, a temporary end to the détente. So when the USSR invades Afghanistan, we're actually going to ally with Afghanistan and actually provide them with weapons that they will use on us as when we get into their country after 9/11. So it comes full circle. But remember, Afghanistan is one of the satellite countries, and so they're going to, of the Soviet Union, and Afghanistan is actually going to stand up to the Soviet Union and say, look, this is, remember, the Soviet Union is not going strong anymore. They're actually failing. And so their satellite countries that were having to be so dependent on the Soviet Union during the Cold War no longer is, they're losing their support. And they're not getting food and they're not getting money and stuff like that they need from the Soviet Union. And so it starts to become a very big problem. And so Afghanistan is actually going to rise up against the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union, to stop that, will invade, and that's going to be a problem for the U.S. So Jimmy Carter is actually going to halt grain sales to the Soviet Union. And I say grain sales. Not grain. So our bread basket, the middle of the United States, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, parts of South Dakota, that is all the bread basket, right? So it is known as the bread basket of the world because that is a very good area. It's got good land for wheat and grains and corn and stuff like that. Well, in Russia, it's pretty much a ice wasteland, and they can't really grow a whole lot of stuff, and so they depend on us for grain to produce foods and bread and stuff like that. Well, Jimmy Carter's actually going to halt that. He's going to say, nope, we're going to place a halt on that import or that export to the Soviet Union. And then the U.S. is actually going to boycott the 1980 Olympics in Moscow. It's the Summer Olympics, I believe. And so, and then it actually postpones the ratification of a new arms control agreement, which was the SALT II agreement. Remember, we had SALT I. SALT I, the Strategic Arms Limitations Treaty with Nixon, and then we're going to have SALT II, which was just a more advanced treaty. And after the U.S. after the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, Jimmy Carter's like, nope, we're not even going to ratify that. We're not even going to do anything with it. And it really becomes a problem. Okay, we're going to start to see the Iranian Revolution, which the Shah, or the ruler of Iran, was an ally of the United States. But he was also a dictator who had used brutal measures against his opponents. Guys, we're going to see this with a lot of dictators. We've seen it with Stalin, we've seen it with Hitler, we've seen it with Mussolini. We're going to continue to see it throughout the world, especially as we get into the more modern era. But he had promised greater freedoms to his people. And this is going to be a problem. There's going to be a revolution or a protest against him. Of course, there's going to be demonstrations that break out against him. In October of 79, Carter extends the courtesy for the Shah to attend the United States or enter the United States for medical purposes only, and he's actually able to receive medical treatment that he would not be able to get in Iran or any other countries in Europe or in Asia, and so he's able to come to the U.S. for that, and that is seen as a lot of the United States and a lot of people actually see that as like a backhand to them from the United States, and so that's gives us a little bit of a black eye because we allowed a ruthless dictator to enter the United States for medical treatment. Of course, the demonstrators, so Iranian students actually seized the staff at the U.S. Embassy in Iran, and it's actually going to lead to the Iranian hostage crisis. And this is where the hostages are taken at the U.S. Embassy in Iran were blindfolded and tied up. They were kept for more than a year. Our image actually suffers because of the inability to free the hostages. Carter's not able, his last year in office, he has a lot going on, and he's actually not able to get our hostages released until the day Reagan is actually inaugurated into office. Okay, so the result of the hostage crisis, I just gave it to you. So the U.S. imposed economic sanctions on Iran until they were released. Of course, that didn't do anything because you have other countries like Palestine and other different Middle Eastern countries that are actually helping Iran out. So the economic sanctions really doesn't hurt them that much. You have an attempt to rescue the hostages had failed. And that really comes from the movie Argo, and I'll write that up for you. An attempt to rescue the hostages failed. The hostages were released on the day that Carter left office, so Inauguration Day, which is like January 21st, 1981-ish. So the day Reagan takes office, the hostages are released. And so people see it, they don't give it to Carter as a positive. They see the Iranian hostage crisis as a negative in Carter's presidency, and that's the first positive of Reagan's presidency, is the release of the hostages. And so it's kind of that, catch-22 on that one. We have an influx of immigrants into the United States that made some schools adopt bilingual education, and you had to. Some immigrants didn't speak English, and so they only spoke their native languages, and so they were instructed in both English and their native language. So they were taught the lesson in their native language or in English, and then it was translated into English or their native language after that point. They do teach bilingual education still today, and that's for even those that, they teach it so students can actually become bilingual, and they can learn Spanish, or they can learn another language as they're being taught, especially in the lower grades, like in first and second grade. They begin doing this, so it's easier for children to learn a new language at that age. Some Americans objected to this. We probably still see that today, but it is what it is, and we just smile and go on about it. It's a great thing about democracy. All right, so we had a shift in population, and it came from the Rust Belt, which is up here in your picture. It's this Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, New York area, Pennsylvania area, and they're going to move pretty much across the country down to the Sun Belt, and that's your Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, parts of Utah, Colorado, Nevada, parts of California, that kind of thing. And because of this is going to happen because of the heavy industry in the area is actually going to decline. Well, because if we are not making money, our economy is not making money, our people are not making money, then heavy industries are going to decline, like automobile industries. And so you're going to start seeing that move into the southwestern areas, okay? We're going to see changes in the use of technology. So technology is actually going to contribute to the move from the Rust Belt to the Sun Belt. Widespread use of air conditioning made living in hot summer months more comfortable. So you can go live in Arizona where it's 110 degrees on some days, or in the Mojave Desert in California. You can go live in these areas, in Phoenix, where, it's ridiculous, but you have air conditioning and you can survive. It makes it more comfortable. This is where you're going to start to see an influx from the northern countries down into the northern states into the southern states because of air conditioning. It's going to make a big deal. We start to see our immigration, or our migration pattern change into the hotter areas because people want to live there because of you have the ability for air conditioning now. Of course, many Sunbelt states are going to be conservative, which is going to increase the votes for the Republican nominee. Okay, we don't need this because I'm not going to go over that because you don't have a STAAR test, so it's not important. Okay, so that's the end of your Jimmy Carter presidency into Reagan. I will talk to y'all later.